Welcome to this space dedicated to the dissemination of scientific knowledge, designed for medical specialists, students, and the general public interested in healthcare. Today, we will analyze a fundamental research paper titled Colloid Cyst of the Third Ventricle, Case Description and Literature Review. This significant article was developed by researchers Roldán-Valadez, Hernández Martínez, Elizalde Acosta, and Osorio Peralta. Originally published in 2003, this study offers a critical perspective on an intracranial lesion that, while histologically benign, can obstruct the flow of cerebrospinal fluid and lead to sudden death. Join us as we discover how the use of advanced imaging technology, such as magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, can make the difference between life and death by enabling an accurate diagnosis and timely surgical treatment in these clinical cases. Legal disclaimer: this material is for educational and scientific dissemination purposes only. Its goal is to democratize access to the knowledge generated in specialized academic publications. Due to the dynamic nature of medical science, the information presented reflects the data available at the time of the original article's publication and may be subject to subsequent updates. Not medical advice. Under no circumstances does the information presented constitute a medical recommendation. The graphic resources used are only a representation of the article presented and are not completely accurate to human anatomy. For more information, you may pause the video.
So, today we're going to talk about a real medical paradox. It's called the colloid cyst of the third ventricle. Now, this is a type of brain lesion that's technically benign, non-cancerous, but its location can make it incredibly life-threatening. Let's dig into how something that sounds so harmless can actually pose such a massive risk.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get to know the cyst itself. Then we'll see how it affects a real patient. After that, we'll decode the scans doctors use, check out the amazing minimally invasive surgery that can fix the problem, and then we'll wrap it all up with the most important things to remember.
Okay, first things first, we have to tackle this central paradox, this idea of a benign threat. Let's unpack what a colloid cyst is, and why, deep inside the brain, location is literally everything.
I mean, just think about that question for a second. We hear the word benign, and we all breathe a sigh of relief, right? We think harmless. But inside the incredibly complex architecture of the human brain, even a non-cancerous growth can cause some really critical, life-threatening problems.
So what is this thing exactly? Well, clinically speaking, it's a smooth, round cyst that's filled with a kind of gelatin-like goo. But the most important part of this whole definition is its address. The anterosuperior part, that means the very top front, of a critical chamber deep in the brain called the third ventricle.
And these things are super rare. They make up less than 1% of all tumors inside the skull. But for the 3 people per million who are affected by this each year, understanding this condition is, of course, absolutely crucial.
Okay, so here's where the trouble starts. The third ventricle has these 2 tiny channels. They're called the foramina of Monro. You can basically think of them as drains that let cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, flow through the brain. A colloid cyst, just because of where it sits, can land right on top of these drains and act like a plug in a sink.
And when that happens, the cyst can act just like a ball valve in a pipe. It can block the flow of that CSF either on and off, or sometimes completely, causing all that fluid to back up. This leads to a really dangerous increase in pressure inside the skull, a condition called hydrocephalus, which can cause just awful headaches, neurological issues, and in really severe cases, it can even cause sudden death.
So you can see how this plays out in the real world. Let's walk through a case study from the literature. This is going to show us exactly how these dangerous symptoms can just suddenly explode in a patient.
So picture this. A 36-year-old man arrives at the hospital, and he needs an urgent MRI of his brain. Why? Because he's showing all the classic signs of severe intracranial hypertension. That's that dangerous pressure buildup we were just talking about.
And his symptoms were, they were really serious. He had these intense headaches right around his eyes, loss of sphincter control, and something called papodema. That's when the optic nerve at the back of the eye actually starts to swell, and it's a huge red flag for dangerously high pressure in the skull. And to make everything worse, a shunt that had been put in 3 years before to relieve this pressure had stopped working. So his situation was absolutely critical. Okay, so the patient is in critical condition. How do doctors figure out exactly what's going on? Well, this is where advanced imaging, specifically the MRI scan, becomes 100% essential.
Now, the patient's MRI gave the doctor some vital clues. On one type of scan, what's called a T1 weighted image, the cyst appeared hyper-intense, which just means it was very bright. That suggested it was full of protein-rich fluid. But on another scan, the T2 image, it was iso-intense, meaning it kind of blended in with the brain tissue around it. This was a hint that the stuff inside was probably thick and gelatinous. And these details, they're not just for diagnosis, they are crucial for planning the surgery.
So, there it was. The MRI confirmed everything. It showed a clear mass, the colloid cyst, acting like a plug on that foramen of Monro. This was causing the ventricles to swell up with fluid, and it was obvious that the old shunt just wasn't doing its job anymore. The full picture of the problem was finally clear.
With a diagnosis locked in, the team moved on to the solution. And, in this particular case, they went with a modern, minimally invasive approach to deal with the cyst head-on.
The procedure they chose has this really long, complicated name, but the idea behind it is actually brilliantly simple. Instead of a huge surgery opening up the skull, the surgeons make just a tiny incision. Through that little opening, they guide a very thin tube with a camera on the end, an endoscope, deep into the brain's ventricles, and they drive it right to the cyst. And from there, they can drain it, which immediately relieves all that pressure and gets the spinal fluid flowing normally again.
The goals for this surgery were super clear and direct. First, get rid of the blockage. Second, get the pressure inside the brain back to normal. And third, remove the entire cyst to make absolutely sure it never causes a problem ever again.
So, we've seen how imaging helped in this one specific case, but how does this connect to the bigger picture? Well, it turns out this is a perfect example of how doctors use scans not just to diagnose, but to actually predict the best way to treat the problem.
And this is where diagnostic imaging becomes this incredibly powerful tool. The way the cyst looks on a scan can actually tell the surgeon what it's made of. For instance, if it's hypodense or less dense on a CT scan, the fluid inside is probably pretty thin, and it can just be drained with a needle. But if it's hyperdense on a CT or dark on a T2 MRI, like in our patient's case, the stuff inside is likely thick and gooey, which means surgery is going to be the much better approach.
This quote from the research paper just sums it up perfectly. By looking closely at the MRI, surgeons can predict if simply draining the cyst will work or if they need to switch gears to a different procedure right from the start. This saves time, it reduces risk, and it leads to much better outcomes for the patient. It's really a perfect example of imaging directly guiding treatment.
So, what have we learned from all this? Let's bring everything together and highlight the most important takeaways from this deep dive into the colloid cyst.
Okay, let's recap the big points. First, we've learned that a benign tumor isn't always harmless, especially in the brain, where location is everything. Second, the real danger here comes from blocking the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, which causes that dangerous spike in pressure. Third, MRI isn't just for finding the problem. It actually helps surgeons predict what the cyst is made of, letting them choose the right tool for the job. And finally, modern endoscopic surgery is an incredible, minimally invasive way to solve the problem and get things back to normal.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. We've seen how today's imaging lets surgeons plan their attack with incredible detail. So as that technology gets even better and gives them even more insight before they ever make a single incision, you have to wonder, how much more effective and safe can these delicate brain surgeries become? It's a really exciting frontier in medicine.
The reference for the article from which this information was extracted is displayed on the screen. Thank you very much for your attention and for joining us until the end of this analysis. If you found this review helpful, we invite you to share it with colleagues, residents, students, and anyone interested in these topics. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. This material is for educational and scientific dissemination purposes only.